and have concept or demand.
Hi, colleagues, friends, and allies. Please switch off your mics. We will start soon. We're just connecting with one of the speakers. Please switch off your mics as you are entering the room. We will start soon. Hi, colleagues. I'm so sorry about that. One of the speakers was facing connectivity issues. Good afternoon, everyone. All protocols observed. Thank you for joining us today in the dialogue hosted by CANRAD in partnership with Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Just before I continue with the program, I would like to ask people to please mute their mics so as to allow for the smooth progress of today's session. My name is Asiphem Khalisa, and today I am wearing the hat of facilitation. Kindly note that this session is recorded for report purposes, and also we are live streaming on YouTube and on the CANRAD Facebook page. In case where we get hacked, the session will be ended and you can log in again after 3 minutes. For a smooth discussion, as said before, we request all participants and attendees to please mute or turn off their mics and videos during the discussion. Colleagues, friends, allies, before we begin today's conversation, allow me to call Mr. Sianda Andres from CANRAD, who will do the official opening and welcoming for us. Over to you, Mr. Sianda.
Thanks, Asife. Warm greetings to the panelists, colleagues from CAS and CANRAD, the students and the community at large. I hope that everyone can hear me. I am Sianda Andres, a research assistant at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy. So today's program is about youth activism and youth agency in a time of crisis, which will be looking at the insights from South African higher education. Currently in South Africa, we are facing a crisis in the system of education. A call by various student organizations to lock down all universities in South Africa has resulted to a chaos at a number of campuses around the country. This has been sparked by a combination of factors related to student fees and debt. The National Student Financial Aid Scheme, NSFAS, could not guarantee payment for all the first-year students who qualified to register, and some universities refused to register students with outstanding debt. The expectations of students for free higher education were brought by the Fees Must Fall protest from 2015, and also by subsequent announcement in December 2017 by the former president, Jacob Zuma, of free higher education for poor students. The conflict between politics of free higher education for all by former President Jacob Zuma and the reality of challenge presented by Minister of Higher Education, Dr. Blade Nzimande, that affording students should pay. For an example, a doctor's or a magistrate child should pay for the education. With having said that, I sincerely welcome everyone to this platform to enjoy and interact in this dialogue of youth and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sianda, for that warm welcome. Echoing what you were saying, that this conversation indeed happens at a time when higher education is embedded with multiple socioeconomic issues, which continues to alienate disadvantaged students. So the call for a more democratic and inclusive higher education system is indeed now. Colleagues, friends, we are joined today by Unhlakanipho Mahlangu, who is a former SRC president at Rhodes University, Nicholas Nyati, who is a former SRC president at Nelson Mandela University, and lastly, Utumani Maqwele, a Fees Must Fall activist at UCT. The organizers had also invited a representative from NSFAS and from the institution's financial aid to come in account to some of the issues that may be discussed today. Unfortunately, one of them agreed to attend, but they could not make it today. And financial aid did not respond to the representative that can represent them. So we have only these three speakers today, Nhlakanipho Mahlangu, Nicholas Nyati, and lastly, Utumani Maqwele. I am sure that we are all looking forward to their contribution. But firstly, the first person who will contribute would be Utumani Maqwele. Over to you, Utumani.
Thank you very much, Program Director. And thanks very much for everyone who's part and parcel of the discussion. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me in this dialogue. Well, I suppose one thing that we would be able to agree on is that, yes, indeed, South Africa has been in crisis for a while. And of course, there's many crises that South Africa finds itself, but particularly the crisis of higher education that we are facing as a nation. And I want us at least to broadly try to examine the percentage of the people whom we claim that they're in crisis in relation to higher education. I would argue that, in fact, when it comes to the so-called youth in South Africa, is almost 90% of young people who are outside the higher education sector, who are supposed to be in that space. Therefore, we are talking about really almost 10% of people who have been absorbed by our universities so that they can be able to proceed and do their higher education, whether in TVET colleges or in colleges of technical colleges. And I want to focus on this precisely because it helps us to have a clear picture as to diagnose the real crisis of young people. For me, that is those who are outside, first and foremost, of the higher learning institution already. And the question is, what do they do in the context of South Africa? And part of the subtopics of the talk speaks about youth activism and youth agency. What happened to the young people who are not necessarily at university? What do they do? And of course, as you would know, I was just yesterday reading an article by Mr. Ngubule outlining the level of unemployment in South Africa today. It's almost, in the Eastern Cape alone, 56% of unemployed youth in South Africa today. And then, of course, if you then expand to other areas, the majority of those people are young people. Therefore, I want to argue that the agency and the activism of students begins outside the university. It begins when they are in high school, when they are fighting just to have access to land, which is, in fact, in a South African context, a constitutional right. And outside the school itself, then they go to the community. Again, this agency of this entity called youth is still there, that they are fighting for their survival in terms of the unemployment, in terms of the well-being, and so on. And I think for me, if we're able to outline that kind of map, and of course, what then the topic helped us to do is to then center in to the few elite who then go to the university, technical colleges, TVET colleges. In any country, if you are able to go to university, particularly in Africa, specifically in South Africa, you are an elite because you are accessing a particular education that will help you to be able to organize your life and contribute positively towards your own country. In a way, if you belong to that 10%, by virtue of being in that 10%, you're becoming an elite already. Now, the question is, why then this elite suddenly finds itself in an uncomfortable space that is outside the elitism of its elite, meaning it cannot enjoy the comfort of its elite. Why this youth does not enjoy the comfort of this elite or the benefits of being an elite in a higher education institution. And the reason for that, it's really partially a historical question. And a historical question in the sense that you would know that for a very long time, South African majority, they have been excluded in the learning space. That's why even today in 2021, in the 21st century, you still talk about young people who are the first generation in their families to go to university. Then it tells you that there's a historical problem that we are facing. Therefore, immediately, when you know that you are the first child to go to university from your family, your agency to make it at the university, to be successful at university in all odds, it's high already. Because you are not only dealing with your own personal agency, but you are dealing with the agency of your parents in terms of the social mobility of your family or of your parents, and the social mobility of your family. Now, all that kind of pressure and expectation kickstarts the agency of the youth. At least those of us who went through education purely on nurses. I mean, my parents were not working. I went to university through nurses. And of course, nurses of UCT, it seems to me that is likely different from other nurses of other universities. Therefore, it then takes me to the question of the elite of the elites. Now, there's this separation of who's elite, who's not an elite, who tends to enjoy the benefit of being an elite, who tend to enjoy to not enjoy those benefits. But another thing that I want to really stress on top of this question of the historical nature of our agency, that it's not only our agency, but the agency of our parents, our grandparents as well. But also I want to extend to say that what we see as a crisis today, it's really the way in which society, which is the majority, the Black people, are responding to the universal call for education. They are entering, or we are entering, the space of higher learning as a universal call, as a South African call that our government, our people are making, that we need to go to university. But what we realize that if you take the landscape, for example, the question of infrastructure just alone, in terms of the physical infrastructure, we have not spoken about the capital infrastructure, but the physical infrastructure alone, you realize that the most universities that we have today, the universities that were built during apartheid. And of course, you would know that those universities that were built in apartheid were built for very few people, largely white people, and the very few Black people who come there. But then the post-apartheid state structurally fails to reimagine itself outside the apartheid infrastructure. Now, if you have a single room, and you are two at your home, and then suddenly there's then kids and external family members are joining you in that single room, of course you will see a crisis there, because you can no longer accommodate the two people that used to be there. Therefore, the same issue that we are now entering the university that was built for very few people during the apartheid era. Now, the first point is that the South African government is unable to reimagine itself outside the apartheid infrastructure. Therefore, to imagine what it means to literally build universities, colleges where people are, so that people can be absorbed at the educational level. Secondly, on the question of how to reimagine ourselves as a democratic state, is a question of capital. It becomes so glaring, the idea of the lack when it comes to money, as we know that our economy is stagnated. Okay, now on top of that stagnation, you then find the mismanagement of funds, or the lack of financial planning. For example, I remember in the past 10 years, there was a call about the emphasis for people to apply. But now people have accepted that they must apply to university before the year before they go to university. Now, people are doing that, and the higher education department, together with NEFSAS, they are falling behind in planning as to how many people are coming to university and how much do we have in order to accommodate those people. But what is interesting about this lack of planning is that the call that was made that people must apply on time, no one is saying, now look, this is the amount of people that we need to apply for a particular year, for example, 2022. We can no longer now open a call just for the sake of saying people must apply, but we must be able to say, look, this is the amount that the university can absorb. And on top of the amount that we can imagine that universities can absorb, is that it's also informed by the capital availability that is able to support. As all of us know, that most of the people who go to TVET colleges, technical colleges, as well as universities, are literally poor people who had no support from their family cannot afford. That is why the prominence of Fees Must Fall was so significant, because people, this thing of education was really speaking directly to their personal suffering and personal agency that they were facing. It's not something that is distant from them. It's something about them being able to access higher education, and therefore it affects them. That's why there was such an appeal. But the third element that I think we must able to expand is the question of the general management in South African institution. What others have called the idea of building strong institution. In South Africa, we know now that we do not have strong institution. And strong institutions are built by visionary leaders. If we do not have visionary leaders who are able to imagine ourselves outside the yoke and strong institutions are built in terms of by visionary leaders to be a student in the post-apartheid state. What it means or what is expected of a student in that setup of higher learning institution. But as things stand now, in the South African context, we do not have strong leaders who've got a strong visionary imagination to lead us with clarity, would lead us with a foresight that is informed on scientific leadership. Leadership that can be able to be independent from the person who's leading. Therefore, that if you are a leader who's able, who have a plan and a vision, that vision can be easily adopted by anyone outside you. But in our situation now is that we've got leaders who are big men and big women syndrome, in so to speak. But I want to argue that without a clear leadership strategy as a people, I can tell you now, in the higher education, we are going nowhere. For example, I will make a typical example in terms of this leadership question, particularly at the structural level. NEFSUS has almost, in the past 5 years or so, had 2 administrators. One was one of the most leading chief executive officers in the name of Mr. Sizwe Nxasana, a very successful leader in the private sector, in the financial sector, because he once led the First Rand Group. But how come that such a successful leader in a private sector, leading big corporation with big budgets, was unable to turn around NEFSUS, such a small entity with a small budget? It means, therefore, that structurally, NEFSUS could not be turned around with just one leader in the name of Mr. Sizwe Nxasana, without the whole structure of leadership from the basic manager to CEOs, CFOs, and so on and so forth. But if you don't have that kind of institutionalized leadership pattern of people who are able to lead an institution with a vision, then you face a situation where Mr. Nxasana faced a very successful CEO who's unable to turn a small institution. But another example, or the example of the last, the previous administrator, I think it was Mr. Fraser or something, from, again, another successful business leader who led from SARS, South African Revenue Services. And you know that he has spent quite some time in SARS, and SARS has been one of the leading South African institutions that has been successful in terms of running its affairs. But what was interesting, you take a leader from SARS who's successful, you put him in NEFSUS, and then when he arrives there, he collapses the institution more. Okay, now it tells you that if you do not have strong institution, you're then gonna have leaders who are credible and capable where they come from, and then when they enter in institutions such as NEFSUS or higher education in South Africa, then the institution collapses even worse. But I'm arguing that the activism of students cannot be separated from strong institution and visionary leaders, people who lead those students in those institutions. Therefore, it speaks to the question of the expectation of this 10% elite South African student who has been fortunate enough to go to university. When they get to university, what they expected, it's not there. In this instance, it's a question of money. Is there a sound financial planning for them, for their 4 years or 5 years or 6-year degree programs? where they can be able to be absorbed. But what we have seen in NEFSAS, all these elements that I'm mentioning in terms of leadership, in terms of planning, in terms of financial management, it's all of them are not there. And I mean, the typical example about this that I discovered while I was at UCT was that you find that students at UCT, that is ourselves, we were able to get our NEFSAS money as early as February. As soon as you register at UCT, you get your money, you are in class in February, you start classes. But in the same province, 25 kilometers away in UWC, students in the same program of NEFSAS who are qualifying, we then discovered that they only get their money somewhere around June, July, if they are lucky. And then when we ask why then UCT was able to absorb and be able to cater for its student, of course, there was partly the lesser percentage in terms of the poor students who were taken by UCT, were able to get UCT. But on top of that was the administrative question, wherein UCT was using its reserves to accommodate us and later then request money from NEFSAS, and then NEFSAS would pay them as and when they want. But UWC did not have that kind of opportunity or fortunes where it has reserves, where it can absorb poor student, and then UWC can then claim that money in the later stage. But I want to close by saying that as we begin to really interrogate the nature and the character of the student activism in South Africa, we must really broaden our analysis outside students. That is to say, in the institutional mechanisms of our country. That is the Department of Higher Education, the NEFSAS, and other institutions that are involved in higher institutions. And then we ask ourselves, what types of leaders that are there? And what types of institutions that are there? Because I argue this strongly, because it appears to me that it only comes to effect the question of, that is to say, agency and student activism at the end of the pipeline of the institutional management. Because it's when the institutional management collapses, it's when the strong institution is absent, it's when the visionary institution and in visionary leadership is absent, wherein the student activism, the student agency comes in, because they realize that here we are in WUSU, we have been accepted, suddenly I don't have food, suddenly I don't have accommodation, suddenly I don't have transport. Now, who was supposed to plan for my amenities? And of course, amenities belong to the institution and belongs to the leadership. Therefore, I argue strongly that I really appeal that we must not focus only on the agents of student and their activism, but I argue that in fact, it comes at last. If you were at UCT before 2015, you observed what was happening, you realized that the only minimal agents that students were expected was to pass their tests, pass their exams, pass their degrees, and go on. Now, the kick in of their activism comes when things fall apart, when you realize that you are like you are being accepted, someone else is being excluded. You would recall at UCT, you would be excluded in second year when you only owed the university only 10,000 Rand before 2015. 10,000 Rand, you could not come back at UCT. They will tell you that you owe us 10,000 Rand, otherwise you can't register. That was a crisis. And for me, I'm saying therefore that it's an end pipeline of a crisis that we can prevent. But for now, I'm interested really, how do we build strong institutions in our higher education at the moment? Thank you very much. And of course, strong institution means that you're going to have strong planning mechanism, strong financial management, sound planning, that's my view. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tumani, for your contribution. Indeed, there are many equality and social justice issues that extends beyond access for disadvantaged students in higher education. Well, colleagues, I'd like to mention that we are joined today by various students from different institutions and also Nelson Mandela University students who have gathered themselves and are currently watching at the CANRAD offices. Hope you all engaged today. Without wasting any time, allow me to call the second interlocutor, who is Unhlakanipho Mahlangu. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm audible and that you can all see me clearly. Perhaps my presentation situates itself at the end of the pipeline that Mr. Maqhele identifies. I must say, perhaps maybe due to my own naivety, I don't think I expected to be here reflecting on Fees Must Fall so soon, especially in light of the things that are happening in the country at the moment with regards to higher education, right? I think that the way the aftermath of Fees Must Fall left us reeling really made me think it would take a while before students stood up again in the way that we did in Fees Must Fall, right? I also think that the COVID setting or the COVID context is one that I could not have foreseen at all. I don't think anyone could have. So I think that the opportunity that today provides us with is one, to really reflect on student activism and to look at this moment, which was Fees Must Fall, right? Before I go on with my presentation, I want to recognize my own positionality now and say that in preparing for this presentation, I was quite shocked at how things that felt at the time like the very lifeblood of my existence, Fees Must Fall, the situation in higher education, so on and so forth, have become somewhat distant to me because I'm not doing that anymore. And I think that at the time we said things like free education or death, and we really meant those things. And we're a bit taken aback when people started dying. So in keeping with the ethos of the culture that we practice at Fees Must Fall, I must recognize my own positionality in that regard. In preparation for this discussion, I spoke to a friend of mine and she asked me, what's other than students being back at square one? And, well, which is, friend, what's going on other than students being back at square one? And dare I say, in response to this question right now in this presentation, that students actually might be far worse off than where we were when we started the call for free education in Fees Must Fall, right? I think over the past few years, we've gradually watched institutions of higher learning undoing the work that was done through Fees Must Fall. And I struggled to really identify any meaningful victories that were gained from Fees Must Fall, other than the change of the NSFAS threshold and the conversion of NSFAS into a bursary, right? One must ask themselves, what good is this change in the threshold with crumbling infrastructure all around, right? When I speak of crumbling infrastructure, I speak of the centralization of NSFAS, I speak of the bad administrative practices of NSFAS. I speak of bad communication, the way, what are they called? The way the financial aid offices within the university space have been rendered almost defunct through NSFAS centralization. And so again, we find ourselves at this point where we are left asking ourselves questions about how South African students who cannot afford to pay for their studies out of pocket must make sense of themselves in the South African university. I think that we have to resist the temptation to avoid reflection, and we must resist the temptation to come here and assert I must resist the temptation I had rather to come here and assert myself as some kind of expert in all things higher education and speak honestly about Fees Must Fall itself and perhaps analyze the protest cultures and the ways in which we made mistakes, for a lack of a better term, right? In order to do this, I'm going to start off by characterizing broadly what Fees Must Fall was all about. It's quite broad, it's not very specific, but I think in the first place, Fees Must Fall was a response to a crisis of national financial policy. I think that at the time of Fees Must Fall, something like 1% of the GDP was being allocated to higher education, right? I think in the second respect, Fees Must Fall was a response to a crisis of political will. I think in this case, it's important to understand that there were internal issues within Fees Must Fall that fueled the reason why Fees Must Fall happened. Things like the administrative issues that Mr. Makhele brought up, right? But the stance of students within Fees Must Fall was one that says, we understand that while some of these problems exist internally, we need the backup or the buy-in from our university in order to adequately deal with the national crisis that has created where we find ourselves as students now, right? At the heart of Fees Must Fall was that plea or that request from student activists and student leaders, right? And we see the response to that being the creation of the police or the military campus, where one cannot even go to a store without being somehow intimidated by police, right? I think also at the core of Fees Must Fall was a crisis of belonging. And this is where questions such as dignity, representation, and questions surrounding dignity and representation and decolonization were raised, right? And I'm gonna flesh those out as I go on. Where Fees Must Fall was a crisis of national financial policy, where Fees Must Fall was a crisis of national financial policy, this crisis found expression to the fact that low levels of funding being allocated to universities from DHT for whichever reasons were constantly being used as the reasons that universities articulated why things were not happening as fast as they should be, right? In the year 2015, what kicked off Fees Must Fall on campuses throughout the country was the announcement of university fee increases at different levels in different universities, right? And another thing that was happening at the time were the transformation issues that were being raised, right? And money constantly being used as the reason in which universities were not transforming and changing their faces as fast as we would have liked them to. The other reason that was happening at the national level is NSFAS and how missing middle students were falling through the cracks of NSFAS systems, because the NSFAS metrics that were used at the time were not paying heed to how, while on the face of it, some students and their parents looked like they ought to be able to afford university fees, they were unable to because of the burden on that single salary of that nurse or of that teacher, right? Fees Must Fall is a crisis of political will. As I said earlier on, the desire of students was to experience the support of their university in the call for free decolonial education. There were internal issues that existed, things like administrative issues, things like how historical debt was being dealt with in the university. But at the center of the call was to experience the support of the university in the call for free decolonized institutions, right? And I feel the need to say that because I think in an effort to reduce what Fees Must Fall activists were doing at the time, it becomes convenient for some people to say that we're protesting at universities for free education, when as much as the university was the space in which the protest took place, it was not the entity or the issue that we're trying to deal with. And where Fees Must Fall was a crisis of belonging, the language that was being brought through was the ways in which being a student who cannot afford to pay for one's education out of pocket was a compromise of one's dignity. The types of things that students were going through, things like living in the library for 6 months because you have not been cleared for funding, things like being reduced to having to use a sock as a sanitary towel because you cannot afford to buy yourself toiletries, right? The university, in light of those things, maintained that they were not welfare institutions, rightfully so. But the questions that Fees Must Fall was raising was, how do you teach a hungry student who has been sleeping in the library for 6 months and doesn't know how they're going to get home for June vacation because they do not have the money to do so. So those were the questions that Fees Must Fall were raising. And on a broader level, the question that was being raised is, how do I then navigate my existence in this institution that was first and foremost not created for me, and secondly is making no effort to accommodate me and the needs that I have in trying to get this education that is supposed to propel me into this elite status, right? The question that Fees Must Fall was asking is, who must enjoy to study comfortably, right? And more often than not, the answer, the response that was being received from university institutions was those who can afford to pay out of pocket, those with money, those who can pay to be comfortable will be comfortable. And that is what Fees Must Fall was challenging. And now that we understand the content of Fees Must Fall, or what exactly it was all about, I think there is need to reflect critically on the violence of the protest space. And I think there's sufficient reflection on things such as police brutality, the brutality of private security officials, and the general sense of brutality and violence within Fees Must Fall. But I think there's space for us to reflect critically on the type of protest space that we created as activists, and the types of patterns within those protest spaces, which were in and of themselves quite toxic, for a lack of a better description. Right? And so I've arranged this reflection in sort of 4 themes that I'll go through briefly. And I see the time, facilitator, it's going to be very quick. Firstly, there was the issue of the fake national movement, right? I think it's become quite convenient for us to say that that was a creation of media, but I think in certain ways, the way Fees Must Fall ended up happening in that in some ways it was seen always as a response to what was happening in WITS or UCT. It was also a creation of our own elitist activism, right? There was a sense or a desire that we wanted it to be the case that something happening at the University of Fort Hare or Walter Sisulu University should be able to shake the whole country in the same way that something happening at WITS does. But as a creation of Fees Must Fall, that is not the way things ended up happening, right? And the reason why this was not the way things ended up happening is the next sort of mistake that I outlined, which is Fees Must Fall as a leaderless movement, right? In the way that Fees Must Fall was created, every protest space, every gathering in most campuses would result in a collective of leaders being formed, and those being the people who would lead the protest for the day. And initially this was done as a security thing, right? And the reason why this leaderless movement was a problem is that at the end of the day, when students started being expelled, when students started getting arrested, when students started experiencing the effects of Fees Must Fall, the institutions that we had to run to were institutions such as the SRC, which the entirety of Fees Must Fall was based on a critique on, or involved critiquing, right? And so really what we came to question is the ability of the leaderless movement to then support students once they experience the effects of the movement or being part of the movement. The second thing was the use of intersectionality to assert existing leaders as above reproach. So you will read elsewhere about how intersectionality was used as a key praxis in Fees Must Fall. And I argue here that the use of that praxis was not to make use of intersectionality for its unification or for the prospects that it brought for unification and understanding how our various oppressions intersect, so on and so forth, but it was used in order to assert existing leaders as above reproach. Right? We can't critique the queer Black feminist who is standing before us because she is queer, she is Black, she is everything that we need out of a leader. And it was this creation of these particular identities who can lead. Lastly, the the homogenization of identity under the fallist umbrella. I think the assumption that was made by fallist leaders was that anyone and everyone in the space is a fallist and is here for anything and everything that the fallist manifesto outlines. But I don't believe that that was the case. Some students were just there because they wanted to study for free, and rightfully so, they needed to be there. In conclusion, going forward, I'm not sure what to propose, I must say, but I think that we need to be aware of these salient patterns that show up within the protest space, so that in framing future protest spaces, we're able to sort of prevent the sense of alienation that came about for some people as a result of Fees Must Fall and the protest space that was created there.
Thank you so much, Nhlakanipho, for your contributions, as well as the reflections on the Fees Must Fall movements. Colleagues, allow me to call upon Nicholas Nyat. Over to you, Nicholas.
Thanks, Asipe. Firstly, I'd like to greet everyone who's tuned into this Zoom meeting. I see many familiar names, people like Spoka Zitao, Yandisa Chubase. These are former student leaders that I've worked with. I think perhaps in my starting, I want to speak about what is happening in Wusu, and say that it would be unleaderlike for me not to condemn what is happening in Wusu, both from the police brutality aspect and also from the students banning police vans aspect. And I'm doing this because it is what is missing in this country. We don't have leaders who speak the truth. We have leaders who want to be populist. The police are wrong for shooting any students, but also the students in Wusu are equally wrong for banning state property. I don't care whether you ban a building or you ban a police van. That for me, and for each and every South African, should tell us that that person is doing something wrong, no matter the cause, no matter what you are fighting for. The minute you start doing that, you lose the public opinion and you also lose the message of what you are fighting for, whether it is genuine or not. So that's the first point that I would like to say, I condemn everything that is happening in Walter Sisulu University, a university that carries such a name of a struggle stalwart in our country. Now, going back into this dialogue, the topic that I was given speaks about free higher education, a crisis we should have seen coming. And to respond to that, the answer is very simple. It's yes, we should have seen it coming. And at the center of this problem, it is not only the politicians, it is not only the government, it is not only NSFAS, but at the center of the problem, it is us as young people. And I will explain in my going deep into the topic. What our government did when they took over the country, post-democracy, instead of building new institutions of higher learning, they said, okay, we have PE Technicon, we have Vista campus. We are not going to build new campuses or new universities. What we are going to do, and this has been a trend, we are going to rename them and immerse them. So according to them, that was going to fix everything. They merged our different universities, they took Vista, PE College, PE Technicon, and they merged it and said it's Nelson Mandela University. Everyone celebrated because it speaks unto democracy and it speaks unto the future of the rainbow South Africa that we want to build. Now, you have these 5 institutions that were only catering for a certain group. These 5 campuses that were only catering for a certain group. You are now adding millions to these institutions. You are not adding more money. You are not adding more infrastructure. You are not adding more resources that these institutions can use in order to cope with the coming group. Subsidies in terms of the institutions and the support that they get from government. Subsidies went down, especially during the year 2008 to 2016. Subsidies per student went down from 24,000 to 16,000. I mean, inflation is rising. You as a government decrease the subsidies. So government decreased your subsidies, stop building residences, and did something that they call the NDR and the NDP, which is to say we deploy or we take people to strategic positions that are ideologically aligned to us as the governing party. You would have an institution like NMMU. We can only take Derek Swartz there because he's aligned to the UDF. The UDF is aligned to Umbuto Pete. After Swartz, it must be Moto because ideologically, this person is saying the same thing as us. Now, in most universities, you didn't get the competent individuals that we had, at least in my view, at NMMU. You look at Forte, how the university went down from its great history. That was the first point in terms of massification, and also the diversification project to say we are diversifying universities by adding black faces, because that's what our government did. We're just going to take Nicholas because he's black, I'm going to put him there, with no plan, with no support, with no building of infrastructure. Now, that for me is not supporting a black person. That for me is setting up a black person for failure. Because how do you allow or think that any vice chancellor would be able to cope in a situation whereby you don't give them funding? Then we had your populist individuals, again, when it comes to elections, who'd go around and saying that we will give you free education, we will give you free housing, we will give you free healthcare, we will give you free social grant, we will give you free everything. That was the politicians. And there were young people who also joined these politicians in making these claims. Now, you can only make claims for so long. There were young people wearing these t-shirts, going around and telling other people that if you continue to vote for this government that is decreasing subsidies, if you continue to vote for this government that is not allocating resources to universities, if you continue voting for this government that is not building new universities, the situation will get better. Young people were at the forefront of doing that. Also, what the government then did was to say, we've now merged all your universities. We've used our young people to tell people to continue voting for us, and we will give them free everything when they enter those institutions of higher learning. Is that they took institutions of higher learning and divided them. If you were seen to be going to a college post-matric, you are seen as a failure. No one celebrates you. No one even acknowledges that you're going to an institution of higher learning because you are going to a TVET college. If you go to a university, you are seen as this person, this elite person, as Tumani said it. You are seen as being elite. Yes. So now you had everyone from high school or basic education sector wanting to access universities, not wanting to access institutions of higher learning. That's why even when you look at your fees must fall movements, the prevalent or the most vocal ones are the ones at universities, because everyone then decided to say, if I want to be treated serious in society, I can't go to a college whereby I'm doing a course that concentrates on my skills and I can go and take and become an artisan. No, no, no. All of us must go to university because that's what an institution of higher learning is. You'd even get a student that would say to you, no, never see it. No, I mean, that is the society that we created in terms of making sure that each and every person from the basic education wants to access a university, not wants to access an institution of higher learning. So that was where we first went wrong. We took universities and put them here, and we took colleges and discarded them. Now, the debate about how colleges were destroyed in this country can be a debate for another day. But when you look at our colleges, they're worse than most high schools. Now, when you have an institution, I'll make a prime example, an institution like NMMU that was accepting 4,000 students a year, first-year students. NMMU is accepting 4,000 students every year. Now they get applications that are more than 100,000. Then you have SRCs, Abo Nicholas, non-Taganipo, who say the university must accept other students. We are going to appeal for these learners. We are going to strike if you don't accept them. Now, NMMU can no longer accept 4,000. They must accept 8,000 because we are going to shut down the institution. Remember, an institution of higher learning is about access, and it's access and also output. So now we don't have an input because people are scared of going out of university. If you go out, as Tumani was saying, if you go out, you're going to be unemployed because here we have a large number of unemployed graduates. If you go out of the system, you're going to be unemployed. So you'd have OASIP staying in an institution of higher learning, in this case a university, for 12 years of their life because they're scared to go out to the real world. Then you have SRCs that would say, Nangono ASIPE has not left the institution of higher learning. Let us add more to this institution. Instead of accessing or admitting 4,000 students, we are going to admit 8,000. It was us. We were at the forefront of that to say universities must now start accepting more first-year students. Yet there is no output. They must admit more students. You then had challenges within the university sector. You had challenges in terms of the living and learning. You had challenges in terms of the classrooms themselves, because as a university, you're only equipped to accommodate 8,000 students, 4,000 students. Now you have 8,000. You saw in 2012, when we look at an institution like NMMU, the challenge in 2012 was about student accommodation because residences could no longer be able to accommodate the capacity of students that were there. So the first challenge started with accommodation. And that should have been the light bulb moment to us to say, guys, this thing is a ticking time bomb. It started with the accommodation crisis. You then had to expand and say, we are going to be allowing off-campus residences where students can go and stay. Who is going to pay for these residences if the government itself is decreasing student subsidies? That's when people like myself started going into debt because the university cannot exclude me or else we're going to strike. The university cannot shout at government because the same VC that you have there is deployed by the same government. So you had a system whereby the only people who were there were the students and everyone was playing a chess game above the students. Fast forward, we went into 2015 where you had the Fees Must Fall movement. In 2015, I was not popular because I spoke about this. I remember when I spoke, I said, there is no use for us to bend down institutions of higher learning. I said this, and I'm still saying it even today. There is no use for us to shut down institutions of higher learning. If you can go back to history books, I said we need to take the fight where the fight belongs. The fight, unfortunately, belongs at the headquarters of our own organizations. And the disability or the disadvantage of university students is that we are politically aligned and we always want to protect our political principles. So that's why I said in my opening remark that we are partly to blame for everything that is happening in institutions of higher learning. Because a person will say to you, let's toy and go to Boardwalk. Let's toy and shut down UCT. Let's toy and shut down roads. But a person will never come to you and say, let us go to ANC offices, because it is the ANC that is governing this country. It is the ANC that is decreasing our subsidies. It is the ANC that is killing the basic education sector. It is the ANC that is not giving resources to the universities. You would never have a student leader in our institutions of higher learning who would stand up and say, let us stop voting for these ones. Let us stop voting for them. I mean, in South Africa, we have more than 25 political organizations. But the same student leaders who are saying, Blade, we hate you. Zuma, you failed us. Ramaphosa, we failed us. 2 weeks after doing that same thing, we'll go and vote for those people. The police, in terms of the police brutality that my colleagues are speaking about, report to the same individuals. But my colleagues will be at the front line in organizing an event for the same Pegitele to come and address potential voters when it comes to elections. So young people are partly to blame for everything that is happening in institutions of higher learning. We need to really dig deep. I'm not saying people must vote for my party. I'm saying that we can never continue voting for the same people and putting them in charge of our lives and expect a different result. That's the first point. The second point is that if you look at the basic education, if you look at colleges, we can never fix what is happening in universities until we fix what is happening in basic education and also in colleges. Colleges have been disregarded in this country. And even that, it is also by us. We need to ensure that we take or reclaim the space that colleges were meant to occupy in our society. Where are our nursing colleges? Where are our teacher colleges? If we can do that and also concentrate on the basic education sector so that a matriculant can come out straight from matric and say, I want to go and start a business. A matriculant can come out straight off matric and say, I don't want to be an academia in university. I want to be a plumber because my city or my country is facing a drought crisis. And that's what we need to do in terms of how do we conscientize society? And also we need to really introspect to say, is our government doing what we want them to do when it comes to elections? Because these things are interlinked. You can never solve the crisis in universities, not until you change the crisis that is our government.
Thank you so much, Nick, for your reflections, particularly the reflections that you touched on during your leadership in the institution, and also to the other speakers on exploring of fallism, the student protest, the decolonization of education in South Africa. Colleagues, once again, allow me to welcome the CAS staff members and team members. I've seen Mr. Haining joining, and also I've seen earlier on that Nancy is here. Welcome to the discussion. Just to note as well that people can also comment and send their questions on the chat section. I'm just going to look at the question on the chat section and give over to the speakers to respond in the first round, and then we see if we have any other questions for the second round. We have a question from Unoma Wetu. Unoma Wetu, okay. Unoma Wetu is saying, thank you for your leadership during your time at Rhodes, Hlakanipo, your learning agency and activism. Our female students enjoy the same agency and activism as enjoyed by male students. And then another, yes, and these dialogues to us. We appreciate the platform. My question to all the speakers is, how do we define and limit student activism? As per Nicholas, that students at WUSU must express this anger and frustration in, sorry colleagues, in this manner, but must not do ABC. Okay, so my question is it fair to define and dictate student activism and agency? So that's the second question. I'll just give over to Nhlakanipo and Nicholas to respond, and then we'll look at the second round of questions. Also, colleagues, note that you can raise your hand and speak even though you have posted your comment or questions in the chat section so as to be clear. Nicholas?
Thank you very much, Asip. Look, activism, it's a broad word. Every citizen in South Africa, as per the Constitution, has a right to protest. It's there. Everyone has a right to protest. When you start banning state property, that is not a protest. Remember, institutions of higher learning, especially universities, are a heartbeat of society. Today you are banning a classroom. Someone there, Ekasi, will see that and think that is the correct way to protest. They will ban a clinic. That clinic is meant to assist that very same person. It does not assist Ramaphosa. It does not assist Bekicele. It's meant to assist you in that community. So we can express our activism, firstly, by protesting in correct means. We have social media, we have media. And then secondly to that, there is one important tool that people died for that we today can have, and that is our ability to vote. I'm telling you, the minute you use your vote, that acts, it's so powerful. People died just so that we can have a right to vote. That is the best way to protest against any politician, any political party, because it affects their pockets. Protest through the vote.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. Nhlakanipho?
Thank you for your question, Nomawethu. I think that the simple answer to your question is no. The ability of, I think you used female students, the ability of female students to exercise their agency is not the same as the ability that male students have to take up space. I think this comes largely from the fears that are placed onto the female body when it comes to issues of safety within the protest and activism space, right? So the simple answer to your question, Nomawethu, is no.
Hi, Nhlakanipho, we've lost you a bit.
Hi, Asipe, where did you lose me?
Yes, you faded towards the end.
Oh, I was saying the simple answer to the question is no.
Okay, thank you. Tumani, do you have anything to add on the questions?
Well, yeah, I just want to touch on the, I haven't really reflected on the legacies of FISMA's fall, because I seriously sort of focus on the crisis and the nature, of course, the crisis and the agency of student activism. But I think to what Nicholas is saying in terms of condemning violence and destruction of property, I think is correct, is right to say that. But I'm very reluctant in terms of how to dictate what students must do and how they must do it. Precisely because we are coming from a space wherein there are people who are sitting in comfortable air-conditioned spaces who then tell the poorest of the poor what to do and how to react in their state of poverty. But what I would, much as I agree with Nicholas that indeed we must condemn the destruction of state property and violence generally, but I think what is important for us is to really try, as this generation, as these people who were the opportunity really to access learning at the level of higher learning, to really assist this country to imagine a new possibilities of what it means to be a leader in society, what it means to be involved. Because most of the time, what we have experienced ourselves at university was the distance of the Black professionals and the Black leaders generally from the university. The university at the moment in South Africa is still outside the community. Now, the community is living its life and the university is having its own life. These two are not together. I think for me, if we are able to infiltrate the community space and university space and collapse the gulf in between, we can then be able to assist intellectually and imaginatively. That's why I was speaking about the visionary leadership that we need to then go to the ground, whether in WUSU, whether joining Abahlali Basamjondolo, crisis committees, I mean, there's a movement now in Cape Town that occupies land. What you find there, professionals, particularly Black professionals and postgraduate students, are not there. We have left our communities alone, we have left them alone without participating. And I think for me, of course, we must be really take seriously, how do we assist our communities? How do we plow back in terms of imagining what needs to be done? For example, what is happening in Wusu? The reason why I'm very reluctant to question what people do and how they must do it. You find that things happen for a very long time. The complaints of students are registered for more than 3 months. And then you find that, of course, in the social media age, that people, even professionals, I really want to emphasize on professionals, because I think as we exit university and exit the life of a student, we enter the professional life, is to then be able to say, how are we going to form a formidable alliance with the student by knowing what is happening there? For example, at UCT currently, our convocation is still largely white old people, right? The UCT graduates who are today alumni, who are professionals, are not going back to the life of the university in UCT, are not participating. So that if you then participate in the alumni association, in the convocation, you will then, as a Black professional, you will then pick up some of these challenges that the students are facing and then be able to assist in terms of registering their complaints, in terms of processing their complaints, in terms of lobbying government as well as the institutional leadership to assist dealing with the problems. That's why for me, I'm really less name calling, but I'm more interested to say, like, how do we resolve these problems together? Same thing, I mean, the last point that I'm gonna make is really about lobbying as a trademark, as a trade. In South Africa, we are not really concentrating in the character, particularly as Black people. We don't have a really strong lobbying think tank groups that are able to lobby the university system. I hope these young, brilliant leaders who are here, and I'm sure there are others outside or in the talk itself, are able really to set up networks and units wherein they're saying, how do we lobby our own government? How do we assist our own government? For example, Nicholas and others here are not part and parcel of the NEFSAS board. If you check at the new NEFSAS board, Nicholas and other leaders are supposed to be there. But because of we lack this lobby culture, this lobby tradition, to lobby our government, to lobby our minister to say, look, we feel that the FISMA's generation of leaders who have led SRC and so on, they are well equipped now to occupy this position of power so that they can be able to assist. Because of their brilliancy, their vibrancy, their energy, they can be able to sit at the board meeting at 10 o'clock in the morning and in the afternoon at 5 o'clock, they are in Wusu. We need that rigor that is absent when it comes to those who are sitting in the boards today. But I'm really interested that as part of visionary leadership, as part of strong institutional building culture, we need as young people to join these structures. And of course, we're not going to be invited. We're not going to be invited in a silver platter. They weren't going to call us. No, because they know they're enjoying that thing. We must there go ourselves and lobby. If they don't want to be lobbied, and call whoever then, so that we make sure we are in NEFSAS. Up until we are there in NEFSAS ourselves, then NEFSAS won't be right. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues, for your responses and contributions. I see we have hands, 3 hands, and also 2 comments on the chat section. The Galaxy Prime, I think it's normal way too. I saw your hand was up, but now it's down. I'll just read your comment from the chat section and read the second comment, and then give over to Dwayne and Kazi Tau. So the comment from Mawet was, to Nicholas Nyati, as a student, if you say the way we express our feelings is wrong, then suggest we could react on the key people who are turning a blind eye on our demands. Because in order to trigger their attentions, we should do something that will make them come forward with answers. And then the second question or comment comes from Sia, who says, we have not yet received free education. What is to be done now? Instead, we have seen greater austerity measures taken by our government. What is to be done? We should call on the Reserve Bank for quantitative easing. Should the PIC, instead of investing in the financial sector, rather fund free education? What about taxing the rich as another way in funding free education? So those are some of the comments and questions that have come on the chat section. I will now hand over to Dwayne, then after to Uspokazi Dawu, and then back to the speakers. Dwayne, over to you.
Question yam the biggest kuchumane Maxwele. You have a very beautiful accent, by the way, Budi, I must say. Just a quick one. How do you, as a graduate, as someone who has been privileged with regards to the financial aspect of education and how the university structures managed to mold you? For example, you were centered at the heart of Cape Town and attained top education at one of the top universities in South Africa through NSFAS. So how do you then go back to poor and disadvantaged others and say this cry and agency doesn't need to always start at the university, but somewhere else? Where is somewhere else to begin with? Thank you.
Thank you, Anele. Over to you, Spokazi.
Thanks, Asif. I'm not sure if I should have my video on. I can just do it with audio if that's also fine. Good afternoon, colleagues. I think my question is now turned into a comment because I think Kumani was getting into parts of that. Mine is just to touch on Kumani's earlier comment on how we need to start thinking about he used the word reimagining leadership, different articulations of leadership. And now he's also speaking to the fact of how student leaders need to think about how they build solidarity, right? And bonds of solidarity and unity amongst each other, alliances. And I'm wondering if the three of you could reflect on that, reflect on your experiences and your journey during Fees Must Fall, perhaps, and post now, in terms of what the context, what the contestations that existed that made it possible, and in some cases impossible, for you as student leaders across political organizations or political affiliations to unite at that time, and whether those issues exist now still, right? Because I think to some extent some of those issues could still be present and speak to why students are still facing dynamics when it comes to them forming bonds of solidarity, right? But then I think in addition to that, and that might touch on Nicholas speaking in terms of how we protest being an important element, right? So it's not just about protesting, but how you protest and what then becomes important when you protest, what becomes our points of destruction when we protest, and which spaces or things, but I think spaces here in terms of physical spaces here, do we protect, do we think are important when we come out of that protest? And so the second is just to reflect on that. If the three of you could all just reflect on that, if those issues are still there, what made it possible, and what are the lessons that some the current activists and current leaders can learn? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Spokazi. Nhlakanipo, would you like to respond first?
Thank you for those questions. Wow, in terms of Spoga's question, I don't think that my experience at Rhodes University was one of an inability to unite. I think that Fees Must Fall was sufficiently a movement that we created that involved all of the different stakeholders involved within the university space, especially as it pertains to student governance. I think that at the end of the day, what becomes a problem is it's how we come to vie for power, right? Even in these spaces of student leadership, because at the end of the day, we do want to strip ourselves into our most, like, our base unit forms, because we want isasko ibonakale, we want itaso ibonakale, so on and so forth. We want a trans collective ibonakale. And at the end of the day, this causes friction, right? In terms of the proposal rather brought by Uchumani to go on and to join these convocation boards and to really sort of map out a way for us as alumni to continue to be part of this conversation as people who have gained from this legacy of Fees Must Fall and who have studied in these institutions. I think there is a genuine sense, especially from alumni, sorry, Marco, especially from alumni, of fatigue. Fatigue with constantly being the bodies that must duel with institutions. Fatigue with constantly being, I don't know, sacrificial lambs of sorts who must do this work. And also also with the fatigue is a sense of respect for trying to grapple or trying to allow students who are currently students now to grapple with the landscape that they find themselves with and respond accordingly. So I think that there's a fine line there of trying to respect students who are students now and trying to respect what they're going through and how they navigate that. And for some people, it's better to align themselves with the students themselves and find out directly from the students without having this intermediary of a convocation board or an alumni, whatever system. So I think it's quite interesting to think about.
Thank you so much, Nhlakanipo. Moving to Tumani.
Yes, thank you. Just the first question, I a little bit missed it. Can you just summarize the first question for me?
Right. Hello, Asipe.
Hi, Prof. I'm here.
Right.
I didn't quite get what Tumani was saying.
All right, I can chip in that regard. The first question, Tumani, came from Anele, who was responding to your call. He was commending you on your accent, firstly. And then he also asked Uguti, as someone who was privileged, I mean, you were centered at the heart of Cape Town, and you have acquired a very qualitative and rich education through NSFAS. So he was asking Uguti, how then do you go back to someone in a rural township or in a rural area who has nothing? How do you reinstate their agency and their activism as someone who is privileged yourself? How do you convince them, etc.? And I think I am rephrasing and quoting Alan correctly in that regard. Thank you, Asipe.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks very much. Thanks. I'll appreciate it. Thanks, Alan, for the question. I think this is the challenge of being a leader, particularly for us as Black people. How do we reconcile the rural life that we were born in and the urban life that we aspire, that we ought to really imagine as a possibility within our fingertips? And then I think for me, as a leader, is that balancing and remembering of the responsibility as a leader that you are what the American black elite have called the talented 10th, that they have always knew that as the black elite in America who has received education before others, you then have that responsibility to go back and plow back and assist your community. And I think part and parcel for me is really, first and foremost, not lose the idea of the vernac, your mother tongue, because it is the vernac language, the mother tongue language, that will carry you to be able to access your people, your family, your community. And I think for me, the greatest contribution that we can make as leaders in our communities is really about the smallest things that we can do in the rural school, in the community. If you've got the financial means, you would discover that you can easily, for example, build a community hall as if you are building your own home. But because of you are fortunate financially, you can easily build a home from your pocket. But in the event where you don't want to do that, build a home from your pocket, but is to contribute in terms of ideas and conceptualizing and rallying the community, as well as the municipalities, the district municipalities, and the local institutions. And for me, this is what I call the building of strong institutions, because when you build a community hall, whether through yourself or through other social entities, you are then building an institution, because that hall is going to be used by the community for having meetings, weddings, and so on and so forth. And more particularly, but the less fortunate in that community will use that hall. But there was a question about our experiences in Fees Must Fall, and how do we, what were the lessons there? Look, for example, myself at UCT, I did not participate in student politics, like being member of the Housecom and SLC and so on. And I took a deliberate decision because I could see as early as first year that there was something wrong about the assumption that the only people who are able to lead or who have agency to lead are those who are elected within the existing infrastructure of leadership. Then I was able somehow to ignite the Rose Must Fall moment. And I can tell you now, the Rose Must Fall moment at UCT gave birth to Fees Must Fall at UCT, because the very same people who are in Rose Must Fall, they were the one who then initiated and engaged in Fees Must Fall in joining other national students. But what I'm trying to say is that as young people, as young leaders, we must start to begin to see ourselves as leaders first and foremost outside the existing infrastructure of leadership. For example, SASCO, ANC, DASO, DA, and so on and so forth. We must be able to say we are leaders in our own right. We have went in higher institution, and as we know that education does not stop by being in university. Therefore, this idea of an agency is critical for us to imagine ourselves. And when I use the word of reimagination of our what is called leadership, it's important because you can only reimagine the South African contemporary idea of a leader when you have reimagined yourself as a person that, first and foremost, you don't want to be part and parcel of the squalor. You do not want to be part and parcel of the people who will be receiving welfare from the state. Not to say that welfare is bad an idea, it's not a bad idea, but how do we make sure as young leaders we rally more young people to see, transcend their own current situation, that is, you are poor, and how do we then imagine that you're not going to be poor tomorrow, and your poverty is a financial and material poverty as opposed to the intellectual, mental poverty. You have abilities to think and create things. That is why I am then proposing to us all, not just the speakers. We don't have monopoly to knowledge and monopoly to experiences. But what I've learned as part of my experiences at UCT at the personal level was to be able to transcend the idea that in order for me to show that I'm a leader, I'm capable to initiate things, I'm capable to do things on myself, was to say, look, I'm not going to contest SRC. I'm not going to be part of actively involved in SASCO or DASO or whatever. But that gave me the ability to be able to speak to PAC students, to SASCO students, to DASO students across the board. And for me, that is important because when you do that at the university level, because our politics in South Africa, you discover that they are very toxic. If you are not in the ANC, you hate DASO. It's an artificial hatred. If you're not in DASO, somehow you must insult EFF. If you're not in EFF, somehow you must insult PAC. Now, for me, I realized that if I'm not contesting these things, but I'm able to transcend these artificial political differences, was to be able then to learn the art of lobby, how to lobby other young people who might belong in other political parties. As a result, if you look at Fees Must Fall, particularly at UCT, you would find that at the initial stage, people wanted to take the movement through the ideological political line. But we were able to convince and lobby each other that if we divide ourselves as students, then we will lose this political mission that we're having. Because the issue of Fees Must Fall is a political question that we can resolve without peddling the political ideological home, that is whether you're ANC or PAC and so on. Now, I am really saying that as part of my experiences is that as a young person, you must first and foremost not limit yourself by political parties. You must not limit yourself by your ideology. You must not limit yourself by your gender and so on, but learn how to lobby other people, how to galvanize people towards a particular vision. I think the success, I'm always saying this thing to people about the success of Rose Must Fall or Fees Must Fall, notwithstanding our own challenges internally, but was to be able to make a call across the board. You are not responding to ANC, you're not responding to DASO, you're responding to the human reality that if you are poor, you are out of university. And then we said, look, therefore, particularly for us as Black students, I find it so annoying that we will be divided on the basis of party line when we know that when it comes down to the question of you having a fee to register at university and having money to pay for your fees, it has nothing to do with ANC, but it has something to do with you as a Black person who's unfortunate. But my last point is really to say that the proposal that I'm making to us all as young people to learn the art of lobbying, it will help to build across bridges, friendship, relationship, working relationship that is focused and targeted for a particular outcome. And I think if we learn, this is really my last point, if we learn to compare ourselves, not with ourselves in South Africa, but compare ourselves with Europe, compare ourselves with America, and ask ourselves, what is it that young people at my age group, at my generation, are doing in America? You then discover that, in fact, we are shooting too low because we keep on comparing with ourselves, as opposed to say, if you go to US today, young people are building institutions. If you go to London or UK, wherever, young people are building institutions. And for me, I think as young people, particularly those who really, they take the thing of leadership as a call to serve our people, we must really imagine ourselves outside South Africa in terms of training, post our education to really apply for for future opportunities in outside the world. I argue that we must occupy Europe. Europe and America was built by us, by our resources. Therefore, we must be able to say, look, how do we go to Europe as young leaders in America, wherever, in Germany, wherever, so that we are able to come up with strong skills, strong imagination, strong oath, because we need the energy to propel us to imagine new possibilities. And I think it's important, if we are to lead this country, if we are to reimagine the geopolitical question of South Africa, the economic question of South Africa. Next week, we are organizing a talk as scholars, chevening scholars, to have a talk with governor. It was a simple SMS to the governor of the Reserve Bank to say, look, governor, can you please talk to us as young leaders? And then we are gathering, let's engage with your experiences. And for me, I'm saying those are the kind of initiatives that we must be able to galvanize with those who have went before us, so that we can be able to engage. Now, if today we'll be engaging with the governor, tomorrow we'll be engaging with the president or the UN or wherever, because these are the initiatives that we must take seriously. We must not undermine this initiative because they're important. I mean, today we are in Zoom, tomorrow we're gonna be in UN, and these are the issues that I'm saying are critical for our imagination. We must push our imagination to the last limit, so that we can be able to propel the intellectual development of South Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tumani, and to Kanipo, as well as Nicholas. Colleagues, I see there are some comments in the chat section. I also see that there was a question, there was a hand. Sorry?
I didn't respond to the question that was asked by Uspogazi. But it's fine, we can take these questions and then I'll start and incorporate those two questions.
So sorry for that. You can respond and then I'll go to the next comments.
Okay, no thanks. I'm going to be very brief. I think perhaps let me start with what Uspogazi was asking. She was asking that what united the different political organizations or the different student leaders during FISMA's fall. And the answer is very simple. It was you. It was the students. It was people like Uspogazi who came in with clean hearts, who said, this is a call that affects all of us as students, and we need our political organizations to be united. So when I was an SRC president at the time, what united us was the students, because it was a matter that was really, really, really genuine to all of us as students. And what caused the divisions was the lack of genuineness. Most of our student leaders were not genuine. I remember I stood at North Campus and I spoke about Fasiha, I spoke about Mzebo, I spoke about Nombendulo and their plans on how they were going to infiltrate the youth league, how they
fund university or TVET placements, in particular SCA skills, and guarantee employment on graduation as an incentive for staying the course and completing the degree. Grant also says the other issue is poor governance at institutions, which is council and management committees. How do they plead poverty on the one hand, but miraculously have millions for litigation against their own staff and students? If education is an apex priority, the budgeting process does not quite reflect that. For instance, how do you take 1.3 billion from higher education and give it to SAA? That thing hasn't been in the air for over a year now. That doesn't reflect the lip service to education. There's another comment by Usem Bainon saying that my question is for the former SRC RU, which is Rhodes University President Tlhakanipho. How does the collective, or do we ensure that the stories and voices of student activists who are or identify as non-binary, queer, etc., are not erased and silenced, and also find expression in post-phase must fall? And then another comment from Usandru Lube, opposing it to Tumani. How can we ensure that the mineral resources of the country benefit the most fundamental needs of the population, especially with making education free? The last one comes from Unolutando saying, terminology often excludes a significant portion of the student populace from conversations that directly affect them. Questions of different ideology also find expression in these discussions because the ability to access a band aid is determined by proximity to some degree of power. So terminology often excludes a significant portion, that's the question. Okay, a significant portion of the student populace from conversations that directly affect them. Questions of differing ideology also find expression, I think it's the same question, in these discussions because the ability to access a band-aid is determined by proximity to some degree of power. Have student leaders been able to make concessions based on the goal, or has it been lost along the way in interpretation and perhaps access to lobbying spaces? Those are some of the comments from the chat section. I'll now give over to Yandisa Jubase, who has a hand up. Over to you, Yandisa.
Thank you so much, Asipe. I just have, maybe, I'm not sure if it will end up as a question, but maybe it's a comment. I'd first like to start with, a lot of times in the conversation, we mention the fees must fall legacy. We mention fees must fall, and we talk a lot about the legacy of fees must fall. As part of the people who were sort of in fees must fall, and one of the people who were there and participating, I struggled to figure out what is the legacy of fees must fall. Is there a legacy of fees must fall? Is there something that we as former or the current student activists, is there something that they're inheriting from the fees must fall generation? Because at this particular point, to see WUSU, to see all of these rising and recent student protests, that have been happening, makes me believe that there isn't a legacy, because they are fighting for exactly what we were fighting for in 2015 and /2016. So I do wonder when we speak about the fees must fall legacy, is there actually a legacy that we can talk about? And secondly, I want to mention, Unyati spoke about how Ofasia no Nompendulo are in parliament, and when we make this reflection, we kind of sort of get angry and say they used fees must fall as a vehicle to their own progression. But I'm very interested to know, particularly from him, as to even himself, at some point he became the councillor. I'm not sure if the councillor now in NMB, but I'm just interested to know, in the current political system where we are, where it's democracy and there's and we participate in a democracy and leaders must be elected in order for you to have a voice and to be represented. Were they wrong? I mean, maybe I'm being controversial. Were they wrong to end up in those spaces as leaders, to participate and to fight for what was really being, what they were advocating for in the fees must fall protest? Let's leave aside the fact that are they actually doing it, but I'm trying to understand, how were they wrong in the fact that the current political system is that you must elect a leader in order for the leader to have a voice in a particular body. So I'm very interested to know that, that this misdirected anger that we have towards Onombendulo who sit in parliament, what were they supposed to do? And I'm just putting it as I'm just throwing it out there as a question, maybe as a controversial one. I don't know. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Yandisa. I'll now hand over to Nicholas to answer some of the questions and also to state his closing remarks, and then move over to Tumani and lastly Nhlakanipho.
Thank you very much. Perhaps let me start with the last question from Oyandisa. Look, I'm not angry at Onombendulo or Fasiha Omgebo. They actually used to be great friends of mine. And that's how I got to know this. I got to know in 2016 already that Fasiha wanted to contest the ANC Youth League. That for me, when someone comes to me and says, Ish, I want to contest the Youth League, media hits, everything, that for me says this person is not representing students. This person is using this genuine plea of students as a vehicle to their own success. It would have made sense for me for someone to say, I want to contest the ANC Youth League because I want to go there and change how the ANC Youth League functions and how we can influence the government. Then that for me would have made sense. Secondly to that, I became a counselor. In my time as counselor, I've never abandoned the fight for students. 2 weeks back, I was having a meeting with East Cape Midlands College, PE College, to discuss how can the municipality work together with those colleges to give them land so that they can build their own residences. People can go and check it on my Facebook. It's something I've been doing. You can go to my wall and check the things that I've been doing for students. You can. We've produced student leaders like the names of Ubaxolile Nodad. The first time he ever went to parliament, because he said to the party, I want to go to parliament to advocate for students. He was given a portfolio of higher education and training because it's a fight that that person always has. You get. So that is the difference between the individuals. My anger is directed at people who use genuine problems of people. It's not only just these individuals that I'm naming. It's even in our communities where you have a councillor who says, please vote for me, I'm going to do A, B, C, and D. Yet the only thing that they want is to get a salary for themselves.
Hi, colleagues. Did we lose Nicholas? Okay, in the meantime, we'll just move over to Tumani up until Nicholas is able to join in again.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to be a bit brief. I think you want to ask a question about how do we make sure not to delegitimize the current student protest. That's why I'm a bit cautious to question the student activism at the universities or what do they do and so on. I'm reluctant precisely because I don't want us to impose what people must do on the ground. But I think also as part of leadership, we must unanimously state very clear that we cannot agree with destruction of property because we know that this property is our own property that we're using. I think we must agree on that. We must agree that we don't accept violence as a means to an end. We cannot use destruction of property as a means to an end. I think we must be clear on that. But more than that, I think that's why I'm saying we must then be able to join forces with students so that we can pick up these issues as and when they arise and register them to the University of Higher Learning. And the greatest example about these lobbying units that I'm talking about, that as alumni of our institution, we must go back to universities to participate in the life of our universities, is the example of Advocate Nkaitobi, who has decided to go back to WUSU, and now he's the chair of the council of WUSU. And that's a kind of a real involvement and active involvement in the institution, in the building of the institution. There was a question about terminology and ideology. I suppose the terminology, it speaks broadly in the idea of language and how do we not marginalize other people through the English language. That's why I was speaking particularly for us as young leaders, the importance of the vernac language, for us to show interest to the vernac language, because as Ngugi wa Thiong'o says in his book, Decolonizing the Mind, that language carries culture. The moment we lose our vernac languages, we then lose the access to the cultural reality and the cultural practice of our people. And of course, culture involves the daily activities and daily actions of our people on the ground. That's why for me, I'm very wary of the terminology and ideology. As scholars, we are also responsible to make sure that we are able to be accessible to the people through the language that we use. I try to speak many languages I can so that I can be able to access the people at their basic level of their human reality, which is their language. There was a question about access to lobbying spaces. My view really, and my approach is for us as part of reimagining the South African society, particularly as Black people, is that we must not think that there's spaces or there are people who will give us access. We must actually start to create spaces, number one. Number two, as part of creating those spaces, if there are spaces that already exist, then we must hone our skills of how to lobby people to get in those spaces, how to network with different people to get in those spaces. That's why for me, I strongly believe that part of access to spaces, it goes back to the question that Mr. Nyati was talking about in relation to overseer who are going to parliament and so on. I think it's important as young leaders to appreciate that we've got aspirations and those aspirations must be fulfilled. And therefore, if a young person goes to take responsibility in government, to private sector, NGO, at university, that is important. We must promote that. We must promote that culture of aspiration and vision and drive to occupy certain spaces and be inside them. And I think the question really is about accountability. When people go to those spaces at the backdrop of representing representing us or representing the people or the community, we must then hold those people accountable so that they can do what they're supposed to do, not to serve their interests. And I suppose part of the leadership that we want to build today in South Africa is the leadership that is responsive to the people's needs, particularly those of us who claim to represent the cries of the people. And we must be able to be honest and frank about our claim going forward. How do we ensure that mineral resources of the country benefit the population of our country? And look, this is it's an important question because it speaks to the economic participation of the majority of our people, the entire population. And South Africa is struggling to to give birth to the new imagination of Black people fully participating, for example, in the financial sector or in the mineral resource sector. I think for me, the reason there is that there's many reasons. Part of which is the idea of skills, number one. Number two, the establishing of institutions that are representative of our demographics. How do we make sure that young graduates who have done civil engineering or law or finance, they get into these rigid institutions that are already there? And of course, you can't expect young Black lawyers to go and start law firms. But as much as they need to start law firms, but how do we make sure that young Black lawyers go to Bowman's, go to, or whether Eastern Young financial institution or auditing institution? It speaks to the question of lobbying that I've been emphasizing in the talk, that we must lobby those institutions to accept the young people to get in. Even in the mineral sector, it's a difficult sector. It's a very concentrated sector. It's a very closed sector. But we must be able to say, what is it that the government is doing? What are the opportunities that the government is creating for people to enter that space? On top of that, we then go and say, look, what is it that the private sector itself, who run these mineral resources, are doing in terms of opportunities that are being created? And then put those together and be active involved. And of course, I'm not gonna lie and say that this thing's gonna be done overnight. And I'm gonna lie that this thing is easy. It's not easy, it's hard work that we need to do. And I really appeal to all of us as young people that anything that we are saying here, it will require a lot of hard work. And I hope that everyone will have energy and to work hard, because without working hard, there's nothing's gonna come out. And I'm saying these things, of course, it's easy to talk, but when it comes to doing, it's difficult. And I'm appealing for all of us to be able to really do things. Lobbying requires doing, networking, and so on and so forth. And of course, people will insult you or will ignore you or whatever, but keep on knocking on those doors, even if they shut in your face, but keep on coming back. Thanks very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumani. Hlakanipho?
I think to answer Sam's question of how we make sure that the narratives of, or that queer and gender diverse people are not, their narratives are not lost in the discussion. For me, I think there's a project that needs to be done to archive true queer experiences. And I think we need to undertake that project, especially when it comes to Fees Must Fall, because I think that there was a tendency, the period of Fees Must Fall, to homogenize queer and and the experiences of queer and gender diverse people. So I think we need to be honest in the way that we go about that project and truly speak with a heart of reflection to see where we went wrong, some of the things that we did wrong, and to take from those lessons what we can. To Yandisa's question of the actual, I think the word that you use is legacies of Fees Must Fall, especially in the wake of the fact that students now are rising up, asking for similar things that we asked for in Fees Must Fall. I think that the question you are asking more speaks to the victories of Fees Must Fall, Saf, Manandoni, rather than the legacy. Because I think there's a strong legacy of, developing a language to speak around the issues that students are facing, and developing a language for students currently to use to take up space within the university spaces that they find themselves in. So I think that that's a very prominent legacy of Fees Must Fall that we ought not to devalue. I think there's the question about what the victories of Fees Must Fall are is a different question, because and I think it's a question that would be more difficult to take stock of. It would be difficult to take stock of those victories and it would actually be a project that requires us to sit down and reflect quite a bit. For me, I think in conclusion, I think that it's important that we reflect on the moment that Fees Must Fall provided us with. Because in going forward, trying to forge ourselves as these individuals who take up space, going forward in trying to aid the current spat of university uprising regarding what's happening in universities at the moment, it's going to be important that we actually look at the patterns that happened in Fees Must Fall so that we try our best not to replicate those patterns in our resistance.
Thank you so much. The comment that came from the chat section from Mr. Nicholas Nyati apologizing for disconnecting. His laptop died. We've come to the end of the discussion. Young people in institutions of higher education. I strongly believe, and I think there has been some that same sense. In the discussions in the chat section and reflections from the speakers that there must be deep transformation as a move towards decoloniality in higher education. For there to be decoloniality in higher education, it's said that the transformation agenda post-democracy took place, particularly with the white paper publication in 1997. But 24 years later, South African higher education institution
All right, hi colleagues, I must apologize for that. I think our connectivity is really against us today, but Asipa was really rounding off to thank all the players for today's discussion. I'd like to thank CANRAD, my team, the engagement team, for putting this very vibrant and informative dialogue together to make it a success. Thank you to my team, and also to Nancy from CANRAD Adenua Stiftung, together with Mr. Hennings. Really appreciate your support, your ongoing support. To izibika zethu today, Unhlakanipho Wakomahlangu, thank you so much, my sister. Khumani Maqwele, he is a friend of CANRAD. Thank you for your inputs and your contribution this afternoon, as well as Baba Nicholas Nyati, who died out apparently as well due to internet connectivity problems. And also to the students at Forte. I know that Usis Noma did indicate that they are in a boardroom somewhere at the University of Forte, watching the proceedings live, as well as some students who are here at CANRAD Resource Center, who are coming from the Udenhague area, as well as Woma Township in PE. We really appreciate your support. Your colleagues, thank you so much for your contribution here, and everyone who has tuned in today. On behalf of CANRAD and CAS, we say thank you until we meet again. Sharp, sharp. All right, thank you, Asipe. I don't know if you have any closing remarks from your side. Otherwise, I have wrapped up from my side.
No, nothing, Prof. Just to say people can now turn on their videos and say goodbye to everyone.
Okay.
Bye. Thank you for the talk.
Thank you for attending.
Thank you, colleagues. Hi, Babalwa. Thank you, Sianda Andres. Hi, Uncle Rodney. Babum sees. Sabulela kakhulu, colleagues Nangamso. Good to see you, Tau.
Welcome back, Tau.
Hi, Chupsi. All right, thank you, colleagues.